Hey, podcast fam, it's Isolda. I want to talk to you about the fact that I'm doing this amazing, really fun project starting January 4th. 3 incredible artists and I are going to be going through Julia Cameron's The Artist's Way on the air every week from January 4th all the way until we finish. Here's the deal. If you want to join in and work through the book along with us, now's your chance. If you've been waiting to do it, if it's been sitting on a bookshelf for the last, I don't know how many years, if you've been wanting to begin your creative journey in a way that feels like you've got a team to do it with, now's the time. Join us. And for me personally, I used the book originally back in 1997. It really revolutionized what I do and how I do it. And so now I want to help others do the same thing. And I've developed beyond it, if I'm honest. And I'm writing my own book on mindful creativity right now. It's going to be out in 2022. But the point is that the beginning for me, the beginning of that creative recovery journey started with The Artist's Way. So if you want to start your journey too, I encourage you to join us and get back into that creative spirit and creative mindset. Alrighty, here is the show.
In that business, and I think in a lot of work productivity models today, this idea that you can sacrifice short-term to create a long-term result. And I realized what I was doing is I was putting myself on hold for a promise of a better future.
Hello and welcome to the Innovative Mindset Podcast. I'm your host, Isolda Trachtenberg. On the show, I interview peak performing innovators in the creative, social impact, and earth conservation spaces who are working to change the world. This episode is brought to you by Brain FM. Brain FM combines the best of music and neuroscience to help you relax, focus, meditate, and even sleep. I love it and have been using it to write, create, and do some of my deepest work. Because you're a listener of the show, you can get a free trial. Head over to brain.fm/innovative mindset to check it out. If you decide to subscribe, you can get 20% off with the coupon code Innovative Mindset, all one word. And now, let's get to the show. This woman is already, I just met her, and I gotta tell ya, she's fabulous. Known as a soul provocateur, GuruNischan helps people rewire their brains and bodies for increased pleasure and happiness, peak productivity, and a lot less stress. With a degree in community building and a background in youth work, yoga, and meditation, and nutrition counseling, wow, amazing, GuruNischan has a broad range of wellness and business experience to draw from. An entrepreneur and philanthropist, GuruNischan built an international business with over $500,000 in annual sales by 27. An unexpected turn of events created an opportunity for her to heal acute burnout and endocrine distress from a decade of overworking in repeat unconscious patterns from a very religious childhood. Nearly a decade later, she's led hundreds of trainings on building the capacity of our nervous systems to heal burnout, break free from indoctrination, and live an integrated life. GuruNischan has been featured keynote speaker and facilitator for Make-A-Wish Foundation, TransUnion, Walgreens, Rotary International, European Yoga Festival, and a lot more. GuruNischan, I am so thrilled and honored to have you here. Thank you so much. Welcome. Wow. It's really, I love that you were able to heal burnout and endocrine distress. I have hypothyroidism, so anytime somebody says I was able to deal with endocrine issues,
thank you so much. It's a real pleasure.
Happy and amazed that you've done that. It's a challenging thing. I wanted to, before we go into all of the questions that I have, I would love it if you would talk a little bit about how this all began for you. You're a soul provocateur. You look at some of the deepest and also most far-flung aspects of what it means to be human. How did it begin for you? Where did you start?
Yeah, having been raised in a yoga, spiritual, religious culture in America, but not of mainstream American culture, I was very aware of my otherness from the time I was born. We were pioneers of the health food and whole food movement, early vegetarians in the 70s and 80s. we wore turbans and wore all white and practiced yoga and meditation. And, it was very much an appropriated example of the Sikh religion, kind of taken on by hippies and whiteness that kind of took it over as their own life. And my parents were that way. They converted to this lifestyle early in the 70s or late 60s. That's how I got my name. And, by the age of 15, I was very aware that this was no idyllic experience. Yes, there was amazing good parts, but there was plenty of religious hypocrisy. There was a lot of infidelity. There was just a culture of silence, and I could tell underlying abuse. And I wasn't interested in so many aspects of the way I was raised. And yet I also really loved so many aspects. And so I felt like all of us, we all grow up with circumstances that are possibly really great and also others that are not so great, all combined. And I felt like it was just my job as a human being to just reconcile, right? Do the best I could to take the good, leave the rest. And I really felt like I had done that in my adult life. I had, done innovative things. By the time I was 18, I moved overseas and I did my university work independently. And I felt like I was innovative, and I felt like I was also healing from my past, taking the good parts and discarding everything else. And what I didn't realize, which I came to realize in 2012, was I had pursued a life thinking that I had evolved past the abuses of my upbringing. And in 2012, I had, after a decade of building a business, evolving into what I felt was a more integrated example of myself, leaving the religious dogma behind and keeping the health conscious good parts that I was telling myself in my own narrative. But in 2012, my business that I had spent a decade building in the wellness industry and creating a very loyal sales organization, it literally collapsed. And I found myself facing the reality that a marriage I thought was good and a business I thought was good literally imploded in a very short period of time. And there was just a feeling sense of, this is so familiar. Some of the familiarity was like I was being kicked out of my own family. I felt ostracized from people I loved. I had dedicated a decade to building something I believed in, and it was gone. And all of these things reminded me of my upbringing. And at the time, I didn't fully admit it. I didn't believe that it was a cult in and of itself. I felt like it was really housed within a long, historical, legitimate religion. But I came to realize that it really absolutely was a cult. And there was a lot more unconscious psychological manipulation and indoctrination that was still living within me, that this collapse of my business made me pause.
I'm taking
and
a second
look
to
at
take all of
myself
that
and
in.
look at the world in a different way, so I could begin to dismantle
that
what was repeating from my past that I didn't
blows
fully
my mind, quite frankly,
have conscious
that you
awareness
had the
of.
awareness of knowing that some of these unconscious patterns still persisted. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you built that awareness so that you could dismantle some of those patterns, recognize them, and then dismantle them. What happened that you were able to create that for yourself?
Well, I think number one, I saw myself as an aware person. That was very much a part of my identity and the identity I received growing up. The yoga I grew up practicing was called Kundalini yoga. It's considered to be the yoga of awareness. So I grew up within a culture that really taught us that we have a direct relationship to our own soul and kind of messages that we're here to bring to the world. But at the same time, that got wrapped around indoctrination that we need a teacher, so it was confusing. It was like, on one hand, we had the direct information by listening to the awareness and the wisdom within us. And then simultaneously and you'll be nothing if you don't follow these rules. And so I remember discarding the part that I didn't think I liked, the part that was telling me how I had to live my life and fit me into a box. And I remember keeping the part that was like, if I'm willing to get still inside, the information is always there. And what I had discovered from my decade long in business is I was really, really busy inside. And my business only amplified that because I wanted to tend and support my customers, tend and support my sales team. I wanted to grow and amplify. So at that time, what I didn't fully understand was, yes, I had awareness of myself, but I didn't necessarily know how to listen to what information was being communicated to me. And so unconsciously, I just kind of stayed busy because I wasn't ready for that information. And so when everything fell apart, I guess my approach was, I felt like, gosh, there's no way that I could spend a decade building something that meant so much to me and have it collapse if there wasn't a bigger message.
Sounds to me like
I mean, I've always lived my life that way. I felt like nothing happens randomly if we're willing to look at it through a different lens than we've ever been taught to see.
Decades of what you've said is indoctrination. That's what you've called it. That takes a lot of mental strength and agility, yes. I imagine, to recognize the indoctrination and to break free from it. What enabled you to do that, especially when you were going through repeating these patterns, like you said, when your business and your marriage, your primary relationship, collapsed? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, what I have to say is that insight came in small doses when I was ready for them. So it wasn't like a huge tsunami. I think the tsunami was the collapse of my business. And obviously looking back and recognizing me allowing the collapse of my marriage and just setting aside a lot of areas that made me happy in the name of sacrificing for the future. So in that business, and I think in a lot of work productivity models today, this idea that you can sacrifice short term to create a long term result. And I realized what I was doing is I was putting myself on hold for a promise of a better future. And so when I looked at that, I didn't understand like the parallels. It's not like I immediately saw my whole upbringing as bad because I didn't. There was so much good stuff in the way I was raised that I wasn't in my right mind, willing or able to put it all into a category of this is indoctrination. So I wasn't there right away. That came a while later. But what I did do was pause. I paused enough to start listening to what my body was communicating to me instead of what my mind was telling me my body was telling me. And I'm going to repeat that because having grown up in a yoga culture, I thought I was very in tune with my body. So at that time, my identity was one of awareness. I really thought I had high level awareness of myself. But what I didn't understand was that I didn't grow up learning about mental health. I grew up learning everything through a spiritual or religious lens. And so I related to any health ailment through that lens. And so when I burnt out and I saw this nebulous parallel between my upbringing and my business collapsing, I didn't know what to do. I just knew I had to listen differently. And so it was almost like going on a treasure hunt, and the treasure hunt was inside of my body. And I was willing to start listening and paying attention to my body in a way that I had never been taught to. And so for me, that showed up as starting in the place where I was most comfortable, like where I thought I found solace, where I thought I found peace, was through the practice of Kundalini yoga and meditation, because that was my narrative. My whole life, I had extracted the dogma, kept the health consciousness stuff, and I really thought the yoga was this innovative neuroscience-based yoga. And I didn't know how much my body was actually a prisoner of this practice. And it was being held captive from feeling what I was actually feeling.
Okay.
Versus
so
feeling a sensation that I had been told was peace,
how do you
or I had been told was prosperity.
Awareness then to tell the difference between what you're told is peace, what you're told is prosperity or happiness, and what your body might actually be telling you, which might be the same message. Your body might be telling you the same message, I imagine, or it might be telling you something different that you don't know is different. How do you build that awareness?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Correct. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I've come to learn that we build it by creating a relationship to the sensory system. And this is very trauma informed, which I didn't grow up very trauma informed. So I've learned this over the last, say, 5 years, that the sensory body, the body is communicating through sensation. Right. And one of the reasons we live such busy lives is because if we actually paused and listened to what the body was communicating, we wouldn't be able to keep functioning like machines, because we're tired or we need rest or whatever. And so, it's not just our families or our religions or our communities' fault. It's a larger cultural paradigm that values us based on our productivity. So as we learn to slow down and we pause and we rest more and sleep, we start to listen to what the body's communicating. And for me, my body was communicating lots of things. I had inflammation in my upper hiatal rib cage area, what most people would call a hiatal hernia. I had a lot of inflammation in my joints and in my gut, and my digestion was very, very tight. I was exhausted, but I was also using my energy exhaustively. And I found myself having more energy the more people I helped. So if I could give more, help more, produce more, serve more, this is where I got my energy. And that in and of itself became the things I started paying attention to. Wow, I don't feel as good about myself. I don't have as much energy unless I'm out doing or giving or serving or helping someone. And I started to look at that and slow down enough to say, wow, how come I can't feel a sense of the same worthiness inside if I'm just with myself, giving that same attention to myself? And it's not like I got an answer, Isolde. Like, I asked these questions, but it took years before my body started communicating the why. I just had to sit in those places of asking an uncomfortable question and watching the awarenesses come out of me. And I think that's what this process of learning to tell the difference is really about, is we override. This is what I call a default setting. We all have conditioned patterns. It's like a computer that comes from the manufacturer. It's not bad to have a conditioned setting. It's like the manufacturer sets up those conditions and those default settings for a reason, because it helps the manufacturer. It supports the partnerships the manufacturer has come up with. But it might not be the best user setting for us when we get our computer. So we have to learn how to go into those user settings and reset the settings for our best and healthiest user experience. Well, our bodies are the same way. Like, we're born into a culture, we're born into a family, we're born into a religious environment, we're born into a paradigm. And whether or not we think we see it or not, that cultural, societal, religious paradigm may or may not be in resonance with our own soul. And when I talk about the soul, I mean this unique pulse, like this essence that is uniquely our own. It's like the DNA, it's like our fingerprint. And we aren't taught to listen to the resonance of our soul, because we grow up in a conditioned environment where we're taught this is the right tune to play. This is how you play the song. This is how you have to play it. This is how long you have to play it. And when we start to ask different questions, we think, well, maybe I don't like that song. Maybe I want to play a different tune. And we have to go into the body, which is where those user settings are set up, which is really in the nervous system.
Makes me think
and
of
start
the notion
tuning
of the
in,
amygdala,
because the nervous system is there. We just haven't been taught to pay attention to it.
So when we're looking at that idea of fight, flight, or freeze, what kind of service can we offer our body to help not be in that in that constant state of stress?
So I think first of all is, I don't think there's much we can offer our body. I think if anything, we can offer our body attention. And what I call this is the deepest soul seduction. So in my work, I call it seduction of the soul. That if we're willing to put the kind of loving gaze and attention into our interior, the way that we want to seduce our most prized lover of choice, then our body will perhaps start communicating in a way that helps us get it. But without that level of attention, why would it come out of a freeze state or a flight state or a fight state? Because what we have to remember about these states is these states work for us. They support us fundamentally for the number one mechanism of the human system, and that is called preservation. There is nothing more important to your body or my body than preservation. And so these states, whether they're freeze states or fight states or flight states or even fawning states, they work for us. So if we're trying to get rid of our trauma or get rid of pain that we haven't even taken the time to get intimate with,
certainly survival patterns
to know the magnificence of this pattern,
right? So
because patterns work for us,
to me
even
seems
if
to be the
they're
point of
survival
those patterns. And yet you said something earlier that I think is really interesting. You were saying you were revisiting some of the old traumas, and it feels to me like I always look at it like you're on a spiral, right? You keep revisiting the same place, but on a different part of the spiral. So you might see it a little differently, or your body might react to it or respond to it a little differently. So it seems to me like we need to combine our conscious mind and also our body to sort of work together. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that a little bit. How do we do that, and what is the benefit of having the body and the mind work together to both deal with some of these issues and also to succeed and to thrive as we move forward?
Yeah, I think one of the main things is the framework that we look at ourselves through. Because when we can understand that the nervous system and the endocrine system, these are the two primary communication systems of the body. And these communication systems are always communicating. Even though we think we're like higher functioning humans, we're really very much more animal bodies. You know, we have this lizard survival brain in the base of the brain that links right into the spinal cord and connects to all of the glands, whether it's the thyroid, the sex gland, the adrenal glands. And, you know, this affects everything. It affects our sleep patterns, our hormonal patterns, our energy patterns. So when we can begin to realize that the brain-body communication is always communicating and that our patterns are innately survival patterns, and we're not going to be able to become conscious of them until we're proving or demonstrating through our consistent attention that we're willing to look at ourselves. Look at, wow, I do these things because how would I have done anything else? These things have survived me. I learned this from my earliest upbringing. We can become aware of a pattern and be aware of it for the rest of our life and not be able to change it. So awareness isn't enough. Awareness is where we begin. But now we have to be willing to, again, give loving attention to them in a new way. Start feeling the difference, because oftentimes it's very uncomfortable to have to sit with a pattern. Let's say you have a pattern of behavior to protect yourself every time you meet a new person you want to date. You don't know you're doing that, but some internal mechanism goes into a freeze mode. You don't catch the survival pattern until you're willing to sit and watch the emotions that come to the surface, or the sensations of fear, or all of the kind of the ways, the automatic ways we go about our life. As we slow down, we can start to look at the patterns differently. What I see happening more, though, is we want to change the survival pattern before we've created intimacy with ourselves. So meaning we're trying to change the pattern before we even fully appreciate and understand why that pattern exists and how we actually desperately still need it in order to function day to day.
Can be something that, for example, started very young, and it could be even a beneficial pattern, or at least something that we thought was a beneficial pattern or something that helped us survive. It could also be a traumatic pattern. And it makes me wonder if we have these patterns, if we have these unconscious patterns that we keep replaying, in part because they're safe, or we know them, or they've worked in the past. What you said about slowing down, is that the key to releasing some of these, or dealing with them, sitting with them? Or is there something active we can do? Because there's something to me about we're really busy, right? We're really busy. Most of us are working super hard, and it keeps us from being able to pay attention to some of these patterns. So how do we slow down? How do we start paying attention in a way that will allow us to handle some of these traumas that might be super old, like you said? Oh,
yeah. And I want to pause on that and just say, almost every single default pattern, not even almost, every single default pattern that each of us run on got imprinted by the time we were 7. We're talking about mostly by the time we're 4. So what I think is really important for all of us to really grasp is that there's no pattern we have that aren't trauma patterns, because trauma isn't bad in and of itself. It's just incomplete survival stress in the body.
Can you explain a little bit more about what that, how does that work?
Meaning we can have an experience that wasn't really traumatic, but our body perceived it as traumatic, and therefore it is traumatic. Okay. Yeah. Let me explain. So the body has experiences, even if the situation itself wasn't, say, literally traumatic. It doesn't matter, because your response, your body's response to an incident was traumatic. Let me give you an example. Someone can go to a movie. You can be watching a horror film, and your body will experience the same physiological response as if there was an actual dog attacking you in the room. So your hands can sweat, your heart will palpitate. This is a physiological response versus a brain. Your brain might tell you, oh, that's not real. Your body response is what really matters, because in all trauma-based understanding, the body holds the memory, not the brain. So this is really important for us to understand, because a lot of the trauma we hold didn't necessarily happen to us. It could have happened around us in the environment, to someone else we love. It could have been when we were in our mom's womb, and what happened to our mom when she was pregnant with us. So we're absorbing sensation, and sensory information can be highly volatile and traumatic. But it doesn't necessarily mean that somebody came up and cut you on the arm, but you could have been in an environment where somebody got violated and you absorbed that trauma as if the violation happened to you, just like it happened to someone you love around you. Correct, exactly, which is why the body also doesn't distinguish between a real trauma versus a not real trauma. All of it's real trauma. The body absorbs it through sensory experience, not through rational thought. Because when we're babies and when we're little children, the part of the brain that is cognitive, that is rational, that part of the brain hasn't developed. So we're really only absorbing through the parts of the brain that hold emotional memory, the limbic memory and that survival brain. So really kind of taking the personalization out of healing trauma. Of course, some of the things that you've gone through are personal, but a lot of the times we're holding unconscious trauma that doesn't belong to us. It belongs to a long lineage of our family tree. It belongs to the environment that we were born into. It belongs to the unprocessed and unmetabolized pain of both of the parents that we came in through. So there's lots and lots of types of trauma. And first, at least what I'm discovering in my trauma work is flipping the script on our relationship to it. Instead of trying to get rid of it, what if the goal was to seduce it out of hiding, to love on yourself so brilliantly, so attentively, like you were courting for the ultimate wedding of your dreams, but that's what you're doing with your own hidden pain. Because if it weren't hidden, then you would be conscious of it. And if you were conscious of it, then you would be ready to let it go. But it's hiding. So therefore, it's obviously not feeling safe. It doesn't think you're really ready to listen. And again, this isn't something I figured out. I just started doing it within my own body because I really held this belief that my upbringing had both good and bad in it. And I wanted to extract the good. Well, what I discovered is if we're willing to hold ourselves in these very painful experiences, and let me just qualify that we don't have to remember the experience to heal it. We do have to be willing to feel the unfelt feelings that are trapped in our nervous system memory. And those feelings can be very uncomfortable because they can remind us of parts of our past. They can bring up a lot of uncomfortable emotions of disgust, despair, resentment, anger, rage, abuse, just all levels. And oftentimes when these feelings were coming up through my body, I didn't understand the feeling because I didn't have a memory of something happening to me. I just was willing to just be this body vessel of letting the emotions freely out without having to rationalize them, without pushing them away, without trying to figure them out, just letting myself feel them. And by feeling them, what I discovered I was doing was I was creating an internal space of safety that said, no matter what you're feeling, I got you. Now, this is me telling me. So no matter what you're feeling, I got you. I'll be with you on it. We're not going to run away from this. We're not going to deny this. We're not going to put this on somebody else. We're going to feel all this. We're going to be the river that lets it all run through us. And I just kept doing that. And what I discovered was when I went through those emotional volatile, or like we talked about earlier, spiraling into myself, into a new place that was very dark and uncomfortable and full of cobwebs because there was a lot of unconscious memory there. As I felt the feelings and released whatever was trying to come up. On the other side, well, first of all, during it, I usually felt very, very heavy at least 80 years older than I am, like literally bags under my eyes, dark, heavy, depressed, just like really heavy emotions. And I just kept knowing that on the other side of these emotions, I was going to have more space. And that's how it felt every time. When I got through the other side, I looked 20 years younger. I had more inner space. My skin seemed to glow. I dropped old emotional baggage that literally translated as physical body heaviness. My digestion worked better. There were just all these things. And at the time, I didn't know what this was. I just was having these experiences with myself. But now that I'm more trauma informed, what I have learned this is these are stages of healing complex trauma that we first have to go through many years, oftentimes decades for some people, depending on the level of trauma, of just thawing, learning to feel and get comfortable enough to feel the emotions without clamping them off. That's a stage for a long time. And then that next stage I learned was called having emotional flashbacks. And so this is a lot of what I teach. I now take it out of just a yoga spiritual lens and I give a trauma-informed framework so that you can begin to thaw from trauma you might not even know you had, and then be able to start tracking yourself through the thoughts that come up, the sensations, where in the body you start to have sensation. All of this is like a roadmap that allows us to become a better self-identifier, identifying what's actually happening in our body instead of defaulting to our cultural
there are
acceptable
so many
ways of relating.
When you're in that space of allowing what's actually happening to you, inside you, with you, that there,
I know
society often isn't ready for that. Like you said, there's this default, the default is here's the societal norm. So what do you do then? What do you do if you're in that space? How do you?
That's right. That's right. That's right. You start to you have to start paying attention to what are your cultural norms that you're supposed to operate in. So what will happen as you start this process is you start becoming hyper aware. Wow. If I'm trying to feel safe to feel my feelings, most of the spaces I go into aren't safe. I can't cry freely at work. Well, I can't do that with my family. Well, shoot, I can't even do that with my partner. You just start noticing. And that's why so much of this work is about noticing what is happening versus the narrative we are telling ourselves is happening. Because the narrative is usually just a way that we're managing highly complex trauma very effectively through busy lives. And so as we do start to slow down, you have to start feeling and noticing what your body is saying. And then start noticing, wow, there are most of the places in my life I don't think I can do this. And you just start having those awarenesses. Further, and we start looking at
then you have to
what is happening in real life that reinforces
interactions where
what you already know. It's not safe to feel.
Is that the next step then? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I would say the next step is really start cultivating safety within yourself. So you might discover that your whole life isn't set up for this. And that's fine. That's a really important awareness. And you just stay there. Don't try to change it. I think we try to jump to the changing of a pattern too fast. I think it's a very beautiful place to just stay in that awareness. Like, all right, most of my circles aren't safe, which means I have a PhD in non-safety. Isn't that interesting? So I would rather somebody stay in the awareness of how hyper aware they have become that there's no safe places for them, because that's a starting place to say, wow, well, what do I need to do to start creating safety inside of me? Because we want to go reach out. Well, let me go find safe spaces. Well, what if we don't even know what safety means? We've never had safety before. So yeah, we start seeking externally, but I think that's not where it's found. It's found inside. So the real place I would say somebody to start next is start showing up for yourself regularly. What are ways that you can communicate to yourself that you're willing to pay attention? Because that's right. That's a really good question, because then we start, if you listen to the answers to some of these questions, you'll realize they're not actually your answers. You have default answers that are culturally and societal led questions. So like what we start to realize when we start to notice and slow down enough to really notice the inner record that's playing is we all have a subconscious record that's playing we haven't done that's justifying the life that we live.
And yet
otherwise we wouldn't be living it.
As a survivor of child abuse myself, I got very good at doing the things that I needed to do to stop the abuse from early on, right? So and the same goes for my sisters. So as an adult, what is someone like me who is a survivor of physical abuse from childhood? How do you do that? How do you do it if it feels particularly overwhelming? And even another facet of this is someone who's a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, some of the most intimate betrayals, if you will. How do they do that? How would someone like physical abuse survivor or sexual abuse survivor sit in with those incredibly painful feelings when it feels probably overwhelming?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's exactly it. It's definitely going to feel overwhelming. And the reason that we go into flight and fright and freeze and other busyness patterns is because it's not safe to feel those feelings. We learned that early. We learned if we revisit that, that's not safe. And so we have lots of amazing patterns of behavior that support our day-to-day functioning. And again, I want to correct that these aren't bad for us. These are really, really important survival patterns. And I think that the language we take towards ourselves makes or breaks whether the pattern can dissolve. Meaning if we start to look at, wow, I have the most brilliant survival pattern because I come from a household of physical abuse. I come from a long family of incest and sexual predatory abuse from the community that I was raised in. And I think that's why I avoided feeling these feelings for so long, because within a spiritual culture that had all these teachings on the wonderful grace of a woman, and yet the primary underlying operating system was subjugation and sadistic abuse of those same women. That's a very, very confusing childhood. And what that does in the body is it creates a disconnect between our psychosomatic relationship. So essentially the brain and the body fundamentally don't want to be reunited, because they learned that if I'm in my body to feel that, it is far too painful. No, I'm good. I'm going to stay disassociated. So I created very amazing ways of being a high producer in the world and being a bright and shiny light and giving all my energy and attention away as a form of unconscious self-validation. Like I didn't know I was playing out a flight pattern of giving myself away over and over and over again in order to unconsciously validate myself and validate my worthiness to receive love. So, early physical abuse, early sexual abuse, these things are so early and so confusing in the sensory body that to unwind them later just takes our sweet, loving, consistent attention. And consistency isn't going to feel safe if all you've ever felt was inconsistency.
Right.
actual love and care. This is one of the things I discovered on my healing journey, was when I drew in people that genuinely wanted to love and care for me, I didn't know how to accept that, because that wasn't actually safe in my body. My nervous system was like regulated to inconsistent predatory behavior. And that's so weird to say that my system was craving predators, but when you grow up with predators, that becomes more familiar. And so the unwind, I feel, has to be seductive. We have to trick ourselves in a way back into loving presence. Like, baby, I know you went far away, and rightfully so. And so we start instead praising and loving on our disassociating patterns, noticing how well we stay busy, how well we put ourselves on the back burner, how well we give our time and attention outward. And instead of trying to change those things, what if we just fell in love with all the ways that we don't know how to give ourselves attention? Because when we look at that for what it is, an amazing survival pattern,
what could I choose
then
I love that.
We can actually slow down enough to be like,
if the slowing
what
down
else is available to me here?
The loving,
what could I choose instead?
Patterns, if all of that unwinds it, unravels it, and lets you make that other choice about what I could choose instead, how do you know when you've healed the traumas?
Well, I think everybody's relationship to their traumatic history is so uniquely their own because we have such different cultural contexts. But I think that essentially the way you know is your body communicates it. So because a lot of us haven't had body-based experiences, that feels nebulous and distant. But the way that I felt it is I've had more space. So my digestion works better. And I just feel like I have more space. It's kind of like the feeling you get after you had one of the worst and messy cries. And then the next day you're just like, oh God, like, whew, the sun is shining. And it's like this internal space that's like, oh, that's interesting. Less heavy, less dense. There's less fogginess. And again, these are cycles. So it's not like some of us that have very, very complex childhood traumas. I think it's important to realize that we may never get to a point where we don't operate from our trauma responses, and that's okay, that there's no shame. If anything, I think what we're getting better and better at is how to learn how to be with ourselves more wholly when we are in trauma cycles, and we're able to recognize them for what they are, and then support the people who love us on how to support us better when we're in these cycles. Because I think it's somewhat of the miraculousness of the human body. You know, the human body, the nervous system holds all of this memory and helps us function. So, you know, it's just wild to me that we can forget whole segments of our childhood as a means of survival. Like, to me, that's mind-blowing. And that when the memory needs to come back, if it ever does, the body will remember it in its right time when it feels safe enough to do so. So as we start to remember that over and over again, the body awareness, but I also notice it in the way I communicate. I have less and less of an external shooting of myself outward, and just more of a presence where I can
reach out
to connect, but not necessarily reach out as a sense of
that's what you have to do.
Internal anxiousness, that's what I got to do. Ahead. Like, yeah, like I just mean like moving from a place of obligation. Like I've always had this sense of needing to make the day happen, like this ambitious person, right? This ambitious achievement, start my day right, thinking right, having morning rituals. And again, I love all these positive self-development things, but I realized it wasn't actually being true to listening to what my body was communicating. So being an ambitious entrepreneur and wanting to slow down, and how do I get both? Because it's not like I don't want to be ambitious still. I'm an overachiever. I like that. So how do we still get to be productive and show up to our life and our work, but also create moments of safety and slow down enough to listen and to change some of these deep patterns
to have us. Both, to be someone who's productive, to be someone who can be ambitious, as you said, and also someone who is slow enough to know what is the best way for them to do it. So this sort of enriched internal life helps you become more productive and a better achiever. It's an interesting juxtaposition, a fascinating one, and yet it sounds like I'm trying to figure out how to ask this question because there's so much in it. The self-development routines, you said, those are great. And yet, in order to be able to listen to yourself, to listen to your body, is there a routine you follow to check in with yourself? And if so, I'd love it if you'd share that, if it's not one of these self-development routines that you were talking about earlier.
Well, yeah, I guess what I want to start by saying is that when we slow down enough to notice our default patterns, a good way I like to describe it is we all have a motherboard that runs our interior wiring. So before we can change our wiring, we have to learn the motherboard. Where do we run high? Mm-hmm. Where do we run low? Is the left or the right side? What are we conscious of? What are we not conscious of? So we start paying attention to the way we are. And there's always a difference between the way we think we are versus the way we actually are. And that's what paying attention does, starting to really notice. There was an identity I carried about myself that when I slowed down enough to notice, I realized, oh yeah, I'm not following that. I just think I'm that way. And so when I slowed down enough to start noticing my patterns, then I could start being like, well, I don't want to do that anymore. I wonder why I do that. So instead of trying to change the thing, I start asking a different question so that I can see myself differently. And then over time, I start having more what felt like agency, like, even if I think I want that, when it comes to my ability to say yes or no, I noticed I didn't really have the ability to say yes or no. I always said yes. And I was like, well, isn't that interesting? How come I don't know how to say no? So it was more like learning to pay attention. And then once I noticed a pattern, then I could ask a different question. Well, whose pattern is that? Well, where did I learn that? How early do I remember that? Because if we remember our patterns are set before the age of 4, most everything we do isn't yours. They're just the environment we come into. So we can't change these things until we're willing to get intimate and notice and move beyond the obvious associations. We might say, oh yeah, I do that because my parents do that. That's what's obvious to you. But most of the things we do are very unconscious to us, and we have to be willing to invite them into the surface of our conscious attention. And only when we start to have more awareness and we're in real life, we're starting to notice, well, okay, for instance, I want to take a rest. I would like to nap throughout the day, but then I notice the way my day runs, I don't ever make time for that. I don't know how to make time for that. I have lots of reasons why I don't have time for that. And so instead, I'm just noticing the play of the way my mind and my reality creates my circumstances, because my default setting has told me there's not time for rest, and or whatever other relationship we have to the everyday life we're noticing. So then we slow down enough to say, well, I'm noticing this and I'm noticing this. We may not have the ability to change that because the survival pattern or the trauma pattern might be too strong than the willpower we have to create something new. And the reason I bring that up is because my particular upbringing, I'm super, super disciplined at daily practices. I come from a yoga environment. We woke up at 3 a.m. to meditate. My whole culture embedded that in me. And I love rituals. I love positive mental thinking. I love anything that can help us support to create the most abundant day in mind, body, and spirit. What I did notice, however, when I started doing this level of work on myself, is I was too perfected at that. So I was overly disciplined, overly consistent. And that might sound funny, that can be a bad thing. But what I discovered was that's how I was staying in my trauma patterns, is discipline. I was overdeveloped in an area. And even though those are positive areas within the understanding of the human body,
it absolutely does.
Positive and negative are not one better than the other. They're both just currents, and we need both of the currents for like both the sides of our brain to work.
Inside yourself. Oh, I did this. I can check this box off.
Does that make sense?
So I get that, and but also, like, for example, there's for me, for my yoga practice, I have a deal with myself that I am required to step on the mat every single day. That's the deal. I don't have to do more than that, but I'm required to at least step on the mat, right? So if I want to do more, I can absolutely do more. And if I don't, then I can step off it and go about my day. That is the deal, but I at least have to step on. So is there,
that's good.
And I know with what you've been saying for the last hour that this is a silly question, because I know you're going to say this is very individual, but is there a practice or a guideline that you can give to someone who wants to develop that first step of listening to themselves a little better?
Oh, you bet. The best thing to learn is to learn how to resource ourselves. And what that means is to actually connect to our energy system. And when I say connect to the energy system, I want you to remember that I mean it in a very electrical law point of view. So this isn't spiritual energy. I'm talking about your body is made of electricity. When you go to the hospital, you're monitored with electrical EKG machines. So there's electricity running through you all the time, high voltage electricity. When you put your hand on your chest or your belly, you're connecting to one of the most important nerves, the longest, largest nerve, right? This survival nerve called the vagus nerve. And so just start with that. Put your hand on your belly or your chest and just begin to notice. So put your attention inward. And a really good simple practice is to just notice 5 sensations of your own body. So I'll just say a couple out loud that I'm noticing. I notice the tickling of my hair touching my cheek. I notice a lump in my throat. I notice tension in the left side of my neck. I notice my feet are crossed at the ankle. And I notice my dress against the inner part of my thigh. And so this practice, as simple as it sounds, is actually very challenging for a lot of us because we're not actually taught to tune into the sensations of the body. We interpret the meaning of our body. So we'll say, my right shoulder hurts. But instead of saying it hurts, just name the sensation of it. Well, I feel like a tightness on the inner part of the bone of my right shoulder. Exactly. And this is why I say that, we are the Sherlock Holmes. We're on our own treasure hunt, and you have to become your own best treasure hunter and know that the treasure is in you and beneath all these layers of conditioning and experiences and memories that you may or may not remember. Most of these memories may or may not be your own. Just start having the recognition that your body holds a lifetime of memory. And when it's safe, it'll start to reveal what's ready to go, because the body's always preserving us and it wants you to heal. It wants you to have more energy. It wants you to feel better. But it also is going to hold on to all of the stuff as long as necessary until you're ready to get rid of it. So what does that mean? You can't just in your mind say, oh, I want to get rid of my trauma patterns and then never take the time to slow down and be with your emotional states. That's an incongruent pattern. We say one thing, but we're not giving ourselves attention. If you were in a loving dating relationship and the person says, I love you, I love you, I love you, and they never devoted time to you, then what they say and what they do is an incongruent communication. Well, that's how our body relates to us. We may say, in my upbringing, I really thought I paid attention to my body, but I had been trained as a yoga person in an over-disciplined state that I thought my attention was attention, but it wasn't. It was a massive state of disassociation. And that's a scary thing, to grow up in a yoga spiritual environment and realize that I was actually constantly disassociated. And then I realized, wow, disassociation is a good thing because it survived me. It made sure that I'm here today. And I've helped a lot of people in a very amazing disassociated state. And over-discipline helped me do that. And so what I'll say is, some people, and I'd say most people, don't have an over-discipline problem. Some of us do. The super over-ambitious types, the ones who are overly into fitness, have ripped abs, over muscles, overdeveloped, positive mind. Like these are some of the symptoms of being in a constant state of a flight, because a flight survival pattern is one that will give, over talk, over give, over serve, over help,
attention,
all as a way because something deep inside doesn't feel safe enough to get attention.
A safe or now positive, right? Yeah.
Safe. It was not good attention. That's right. And then, I mean, like in this example, like what if your earliest violator was your father or your uncle or your neighbor? Like this adds very deep, complex issues, because what the body remembers is that love is innately violating. And so what we do is we unconsciously are creating environments where we're violating ourselves over and over and over again, whether we're doing it through work. I mean, I violated myself in my entire decade of my business in a good way. I didn't know it was bad. I was over giving to other people, but violating myself. I didn't even know what that would have meant because I didn't know any other kind of love. So to expect us to attract a different kind of love or to give ourselves a different kind of attention until we've learned how to do it, it's an unrealistic expectation. And that's why I think the most provocative thing we can do is learn how to love on our pain, like love on ourselves in the state of our current being, but recognize you're holding a lot of trauma and a lot of memory that you're not even aware of. And the more you can praise your body's ability to do that,
GuruNischan,
and to let you stay unconscious about
away,
it,
first of all. But second of all,
just
I want to thank
brilliant
you
survival
so much
mechanism if I've ever heard
one. For taking the time to talk about this. And it's fascinating and and evocative. It certainly evokes in me an interest in slowing down, because I don't tend to, that's for sure. So I would love, 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 if you don't mind, if someone wants to learn more about you and the work you're doing, how would they find you? Where would you be on the internet, social channels, anything like that you'd care to share? I'll put it in the show notes too, but I'd love to have you say that, because people learn differently.
Absolutely. On all of social handles is just at GuruNischan. And then my website is GuruNischan.com. And I think a really good place to start is when you opt into my email list on my website, you'll get a free video series called Unlock Your Own Conditioning Code. And oftentimes we just can't see ourselves in the picture frame of our own life. And we have to have a disaster to collapse our worldview only to let some other way in. But we don't have to wait for disaster. We can allow ourselves to be pierced into a new veil of seeing ourselves anytime we choose and we're ready. And that video, I think, helps, but it also gives you some tools to start working on locating yourself. I call it the love process. Learning to resource yourself, learning how to notice and feel what your body's communicating, so that you can become your own best self-authority.
Said, so grateful.
There's nobody that can decipher and learn to listen to your interior the way that you can.
One last question. It's a question that I ask everybody who comes on the show, and it's a silly question, but I find that it often yields profound answers. And the question is this: if you had an airplane that could skywrite anything for the whole world to hear, what would you say? I love that. Truth telling is so sexy. Tell yourself the truth. That's fabulous. Thank you so much for that. And I, once again, am super grateful that you took the time to be on the show.
Truth telling is so sexy. Tell yourself the truth.
Wow, that was GuruNischan, and you need to obviously go and find her work on the various platforms. Look at the show notes and find the various social channels.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you being here.
Such a fascinating conversation and healing for me. It's inspired me to slow down a little bit. We'll see what form that takes. Until next time, I do want to remind you, if you're liking the show, tell a friend. Let someone else know about the show. Let your friends know about the conversations that we're having about how we can innovate and live these incredibly beautiful and creative lives. Until next time, this is again Isolde Trachtenberg for the Innovative Mindset Podcast, reminding you to listen, learn, laugh, and love a whole lot. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you being here. Please subscribe to the podcast if you're new, and it would mean the world to me if you told a friend about it. Today's episode was produced by Isolde Trachtenberg and is copyright 2021. As always, please remember this is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Past performance does not guarantee future results, although we can always hope. Until next time, remember to be bold, be creative, and most of all, be kind.